A camera sweeps across a vast television studio, capturing the gleaming floors and the array of bright lights suspended overhead. Technicians in black t-shirts scurry around, adjusting cameras, plugging cables into control boards, and exchanging last-minute instructions through headsets. The space is electric with anticipation. A large audience stands in line outside the studio doors, waiting to be ushered in, some clutching coffee cups, others eagerly glancing at their phones. Within these polished walls, the late-night spotlight is about to begin. Fiona Carrington, the show's formidable host, has become a late-night fixture over the years, building a reputation for her unrelenting wit and resolute progressive stance. Nightly, she engages in verbal duels with politicians, celebrities, and cultural figures, often ridiculing what she perceives as outdated ideas. Her fans adore her for not pulling punches. They love watching her skillfully demolish her guests' arguments with biting remarks. Detractors, however, criticize her style as overly aggressive, claiming she stifles genuine conversation by piling on sarcastic jabs. Still, ratings remain high. Everyone, whether admiring or loathing her approach, is fascinated by the tension she creates. Inside her glass-walled office on the third floor of the network building, Fiona reviews her typical pre-show routine. She sits behind a sleek metallic desk, scanning a set of colorful file folders that outline prospective guests. Producers and writers fill the chairs around her, forming a semicircle. Light from the late afternoon sun filters in, revealing specks of dust in the air. A few small potted plants lend the otherwise minimalist space a bit of warmth. One of her producers, a slim woman with short-cropped hair named Lucy, flips through her notes and suggests a potential guest. What if we invite Steve Harvey? Immediately, people begin murmuring. Steve is a big name, with decades in the public spotlight. Stand-up comedy, talk shows, game show hosting, best-selling books, philanthropic ventures. He's both well-loved and sometimes criticized for his more conservative takes or older viewpoints. Fiona's eyebrows climb upward with intrigued curiosity. From her perspective, having him on the show could be gold. He's known for a certain comedic style she might label old school, and it's rumored he holds some views that conflict with modern progressive ideals. She sees not just ratings in the offing, but a chance to confront and undermine what she views as antiquated beliefs. Leaning forward, Fiona taps her pen against the table. The other producers sense that she's already forming a plan. She's never one to take on a guest without thorough preparation, so she half smiles and says, "That could be quite the segment. Let's do some deep digging into his background. I want everything. Past interviews, comedic bits, stances on political or cultural issues. We'll see if we can find a perfect angle." Lucy gives a nod, scribbling a note in her spiral-bound pad. Another producer, Jamal, suggests that they consider the potential blowback because Steve Harvey has a big fan base and might not take kindly to any perceived ambush. Fiona waves off the concern, remarking that he has likely faced controversy before and she wants the late-night spotlight to remain as fearless as ever. News eventually reaches Steve Harvey's team. In his quiet home in Los Angeles County, far from the glitzy hustle, he sits in a tastefully decorated living room. Soft rugs, subdued lighting from tall standing lamps, and a large coffee table piled with scripts and notes reflect a man still busy with numerous projects. His assistant, a young man named Marshall, approaches with an envelope. Inside is a formal invitation from the producers of Fiona's show. Marshall shifts uncomfortably as he reads it aloud. "They're requesting you appear on the late-night spotlight, sometime next month if scheduling permits. They'd love to talk about your career, your comedic style, your more traditional approach to certain social issues." Steve reclines on the couch, fingertips lightly touching. His mind is already ticking. He knows Fiona's reputation, her pointed sarcasm, her knack for cornering guests. Marshall proceeds to speak in a concerned tone. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? She's not exactly friendly territory. I can't remember an episode where she hasn't tried to pick guests apart, especially ones with conservative stances." Steve gazes into the distance through a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights just emerging as dusk creeps in. He shrugs. If they want me, I'll talk. We'll see how it goes, he says in a calm voice. Marshall sighs but respects his boss's decision, already mentally preparing for what might be a combative interview. In the following weeks, Fiona's staff sets to work. They review hours of Steve's stand-up routines, old talk show segments, interviews with major networks, books he's authored, and columns that have quoted him. Fiona diligently compiles notes on any remarks that might be perceived as outdated, comments on relationships, comedic sketches that rely on stereotypes, or conservative statements that appear to conflict with progressive thinking. She envisions an interview that functions almost like a debate, believing her progressive audience will relish watching her strip away old-fashioned illusions or perceived hypocrisy. She instructs her writing team. We need to craft jokes that are edgy yet not libelous. Something that will push him but still make the crowd laugh. Meanwhile, Steve goes about his routine. During a taping of a family-friendly TV show he hosts, he's approached by a production assistant who timidly brings up the late-night spotlight invitation again. Steve just says he's planning on going. Some people on set appear skeptical, telling him that Fiona rarely holds back and that the show's format thrives on confrontation. Steve thanks them for their concern but remains unflustered. He's dealt with tough crowds and critics for decades. Hecklers in smoky comedy clubs, daytime talk show controversies, viral social media storms. He's sure he can handle a straightforward interview, no matter how pointed the host questions get. As the scheduled day draws nearer, Fiona grows ever more focused. She has rehearsals with stand-in staffers who pretend to be Steve, letting her practice her opening monologue, comedic barbs, and transitions into more serious topics. She's determined to highlight what she calls the generational or ideological gap, analyzing Steve's comedic worldview in contrast to what she promotes as modern, inclusive standards. She finds old video clips where he jokes about men and women in ways she thinks might be out of tune with current progressive values. She smirks while watching these, making side comments to her staff. She jots down references, the 1990s stand-up bit about relationships, that talk show segment about marriage roles, the comedic routine that got a little flack online, etc. She gathers them all, ready to challenge him on stage. At last, the day arrives. The late-night spotlight set, polished to perfection, beams under overhead lights. The audience begins filling in, a mixture of die-hard Fiona fans, some curious folks who have come specifically because they heard Steve Harvey would be on, and a smattering of new viewers just seeking an entertaining evening. The studio seats about 300 people in tiered rows facing the stage. A large desk sits stage right for Fiona, and an equally large chair, likely for comedic effect, stands stage left where her guests typically sit. Stagehands in black t-shirts do final checks, ensuring the cameras are at the correct angles, that the microphones are functional, and that the teleprompter is set for Fiona's monologue. The overhead monitors project the late-night spotlight logo while the band in the corner does a quick sound check, occasionally tossing out a jazzy riff or a drum flourish. Backstage, Fiona stands at a lighted vanity mirror, fiddling with her earpiece and going over her note cards. She's wearing a form-fitting black ensemble, exuding a confident aura that has become part of her brand. Her producers hover around, giving last-minute updates. The show is at maximum capacity. Media outlets are buzzing about Steve Harvey's appearance. Social media engagement has spiked with both supporters and skeptics. Fiona sets down her note cards, closes her eyes for a moment, and takes a breath. She's excited. This is more than just another guest. This could be a memorable collision of comedic styles, an old guard versus the new wave. Then, with a final check of her reflection, she strides onto the stage as the show's opening music plays, meeting the audience's roaring applause. While Fiona is delivering her monologue, Steve awaits in a side green room, accompanied by Marshall. He observes the live feed on a small monitor. Fiona cracks some quick jokes about recent political events, peppering them with sarcasm. The crowd whoops, claps, and laughs heartily. Then she teases that she has a legendary performer in the house tonight, famous for big comedic hits and, well, a few old-school opinions I'm itching to talk about. The audience chuckles knowingly. Steve remains calm, leaning back in a lounge chair, occasionally glancing at the script in his hand that only has broad bullet points. Meanwhile, Marshall shifts from foot to foot, remarking that she's definitely going to try to corner you on social issues. Steve simply replies that he's heard all before. Finally, Fiona announces, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome an icon in the entertainment world, a man who's hosted everything from stand-up to game shows. Give it up for Steve Harvey." The band plays a short fanfare as Steve steps out from behind the curtain. Applause resonates through the studio, though it's peppered with some uncertain murmurs from those who know Fiona's usual approach. Steve waves, wearing a tailored suit, and smiles at Fiona. She extends her hand, shaking his with an almost forced grin, and motions for him to take the guest seat. Once the applause settles, Fiona begins with a flourish, thanking him for coming and calling him a legend. Then, with that signature smirk, she adds, "I also hear you're not afraid to speak your mind, no matter how behind the times it might appear to some of us." The crowd titters. Steve, still smiling, answers, "Well, I've never been short on words." Fiona nods, crossing her legs, launching them into an exchange that's poised to be lively. She kicks off with questions about his comedic origins. "You've been in stand-up since, what, the 80s? You've survived so many changes in comedic culture. How do you manage to stay relevant?" Steve replies calmly that comedy evolves, but that fundamental truths about human behavior remain interesting across generations. People still enjoy the comedic lens that sees daily life, relationships, and personal flaws in a humorous light. Fiona counters with a wry grin, but we also see that a lot of older comedic staples are now considered problematic. Don't you think some of your routines might be dated, even cringeworthy by today's standards? He acknowledges that some jokes age poorly and times shift. "I won't defend jokes that genuinely hurt or demean," he says, "and I've learned to retire material that doesn't align with who I am today. But that doesn't mean everything from the past is worthless. We can adapt and evolve without disowning our roots." Fiona raises an eyebrow, telling him that many younger viewers, especially on social media, see certain comedic portrayals from him as reinforcing stereotypes. Steve explains that comedic exaggeration is often a tool to highlight truths or absurdities, and he remains open to rethinking material that's become more harmful than funny. The conversation quickly turns to a more pointed direction. Fiona reveals that she's found an old clip from a talk show he once hosted, where he made sweeping statements about men being providers and women focusing on more traditional roles. With a comedic flourish, she plays a snippet on a large screen behind them. The audience chuckles at how obviously retro it sounds. Fiona smirks. "You see that? That's, in a lot of people's eyes, sexist. At the very least, not something that resonates with modern equality ideals. Do you regret that perspective?" Steve glances at the clip, then faces Fiona and says that the world is complicated. He grew up in an environment where certain roles were considered normal. Over time, he recognized these might not apply universally. He's adapted his stance, never intended to demean anyone, but also holds on to some personal convictions about respect and responsibility. Fiona presses him. Doesn't he see how that brand of old-fashioned chivalry can be smothering or condescending to women? Steve politely counters that he sees it as courtesy, but acknowledges that if a woman expresses discomfort with such treatment, he respects that. At no point does he use defensive anger or lash out. Instead, he addresses each question with a measured tone, reflecting on cultural context. Soon, Fiona pivots to an even more controversial arena: politics. She references how Steve has occasionally spoken in favor of certain conservative politicians or policies. "Don't you worry," she asks, "that you're alienating half your audience by voicing these takes? Or do you just think folks who disagree with you should tune out?" He replies that he's never tried to force his opinion on others, only to share what he believes. "I'd rather speak sincerely than pander for acceptance," he says. Some in the audience hush, perhaps expecting an angry rebuttal from Fiona, but she nods, quietly acknowledging that at least he's consistent. She tries to corner him, insinuating that he might be unaware of modern struggles faced by marginalized groups, or that he's turned a blind eye to certain progressive strides. Steve acknowledges that he's had to confront his own biases and that the times are changing, but he firmly states that fundamental values, like decency, honesty, supporting family, aren't outmoded. We can figure out new ways to apply them, he says, but I won't label them worthless. After nearly 15 minutes, the atmosphere in the studio shifts. Many expected a comedic beatdown from Fiona, a humiliating meltdown for Steve. Instead, it's turning into an in-depth conversation. Fiona, who thrives on comedic barbs, grows more subdued because Steve's approach is to answer calmly, not offering her the raw emotion or frustration that usually fuels her comedic attacks. She throws a pointed line or two, and he counters by calmly explaining his perspective or even conceding when some older comedic tropes might be best left behind. The audience, initially roaring at her jokes, now sits in more reflective silence. A few occasional laughs or bits of applause punctuate certain moments, but it's no longer the comedic feeding frenzy many anticipated. Toward the halfway mark, Fiona flips through her note cards, perhaps searching for that perfect angle to provoke a reaction. She brings up toxic masculinity, referencing comedic sketches or talk show comments that, in her opinion, upheld macho posturing. Steve sighs slightly, replying that he recognizes how some comedic bits can inadvertently push harmful ideals, but that his comedic style often focused on everyday struggles, not glorifying negativity. If something I said was truly toxic, I regret it, and I've grown from it, he adds. There's a hush, then a smattering of applause, likely from audience members who appreciate this introspective attitude. Sensing the crowd shift, Fiona tries one more comedic barb, referencing an old interview in which Steve apparently suggested that certain topics shouldn't be joked about. She implies that censorship or limiting comedic scope is contradictory. He responds that boundaries can exist without stamping out genuine creativity. Comedy isn't about free passes for everything. It's about forging connections, he says. People nod, even though Fiona offers a faint eye roll. She attempts to rally the crowd with a quip about how times have changed and how the new wave is leaving behind people who can't keep up. Steve shrugs politely, repeating that if he has anything valuable to say, he'll say it, and if not, he'll step aside. This humility or self-assurance, depending on how one sees it, causes a ripple of respect across the audience, not the derision Fiona counted on. Eventually, she opens the floor to a short Q&A with audience members. One younger viewer stands up, stating they grew up watching Steve's comedic sketches on TV and asking if he regrets any of it. Steve acknowledges that no one is perfect, comedic bits included, and that if he could go back, he'd fine-tune certain jokes to avoid hurting people. But, he says, I also accept that I was working with the perspective I had at the time. Another audience member, an older woman, says she loves Fiona but also admires Steve's long-standing career. She wonders if the two can find common ground. Fiona, momentarily disarmed, looks at Steve, who smiles and says that even if they disagree on plenty, conversation is how we grow. This causes a wave of applause, not the boisterous comedic kind, but a more thoughtful, empathic response. As the segment approaches its close, Fiona remarks that she expected a different tone tonight, implying she thought it might be more combative or comedic. Steve admits he's encountered confrontation enough in his life to know that shouting matches rarely produce insight. Fiona asks him to share some final thoughts. He briefly recounts how he started in comedy clubs, overcame myriad failures, faced skepticism about his brand of humor, and learned to adapt over time without abandoning his core principles. Sure, I've messed up, he says, but that doesn't mean I can't learn. There's a difference between acknowledging mistakes and throwing out everything you stand for. The studio is so silent that the faint hum of the overhead lights is audible. The show's music fades in lightly as Fiona thanks him for coming, her tone more subdued than at the start. She invites the audience to give him a hand, and they do, some clapping vigorously, others standing. A few watchers in the front row even wipe away tears, possibly moved by the sincerity that has overshadowed the comedic approach they expected. Steve stands, shakes Fiona's hand, and waves at the crowd before exiting. Once the camera's cut, Fiona remained seated at her desk, letting the applause linger. The producers stepped forward to transition to a commercial break. Backstage, crew members approached Steve with hesitant smiles, thanking him for being a guest. Some say they were surprised by how even-tempered the conversation was. Marshall, Steve's assistant, breathed a sigh of relief that it didn't devolve into comedic carnage. Meanwhile, Fiona retreats to her dressing room, clasping her note cards. She stares at them, half perplexed, half intrigued by how the interview turned into something deeper than the comedic takedown she planned. That same night, the episode airs in its usual slot, and watchers at home see a program quite different from Fiona's typical comedic lampooning. The opening monologue was comedic, but from the moment Steve stepped on set, the dialogue veered into serious introspection. Social media lights up. Some viewers expressed disappointment they didn't get the expected comedic meltdown. Others are fascinated and praise the show for revealing a side of Steve they hadn't considered. Still others call Fiona out for lacking her usual killer instinct. But a sizable portion of the audience praises the episode as refreshingly honest, surprisingly respectful, or a moment of actual conversation. By the next morning, short video clips from the interview populate Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and other platforms. A snippet where Steve explains that comedic styles evolve with the times circulates widely, gathering supportive comments. Fiona's usual loyal following is split. Some say she went too soft, while others appreciate seeing her let a guest speak more deeply. Producers confirmed the ratings soared for that episode, hitting a seasonal high. Fiona's phone brims with messages, some congratulating her on orchestrating a surprisingly profound moment on late-night TV, others chiding her for not going in for the kill. She rarely second-guesses herself, but she senses something important happened. She rummages through the bulleted list of witty lines she never used, pondering if the interview's sincerity overshadowed them. Steve, on the other hand, goes back to his daily life, finishing his commitments, filming other shows, meeting philanthropic obligations. A few journalists attempt to get him to comment on Fiona's approach, hoping he'll criticize it or reveal hidden frustration. He politely declines, saying only that it was a conversation and I appreciated the chance to share my perspective. Because he refuses to sensationalize the experience, the public conversation leans more toward praising the open, respectful vibe that emerged, rather than focusing on any comedic fireworks. A week passes. People continue discussing the show, especially fans of the late-night spotlight, who found the shift in tone surprising. Some post thoughtful reflections. Maybe not every interview has to be an all-out comedic brawl. Maybe there's room for bridging generational or ideological gaps. One blogger writes a piece titled, "When Quiet Confidence Outshines Sarcastic Ambush," praising how Steve's calm self-assurance neutralized Fiona's usual strategy. Another writer counters that it's a danger sign. If Fiona can't keep the comedic edge, maybe she's losing her brand. Yet, ironically, the controversy only elevates the show's profile. More people watch, curious to see if the next episodes remain subdued or revert to the typical fierce comedic style. Fiona, normally confident to the point of brashness, finds herself mulling over what the next step in her evolution as a late-night host might be. She confides in Lucy, the producer who first suggested Steve. Lucy reveals that part of the reason she recommended him was that she was personally fascinated by how well he commands an audience with positivity. He's not just an old, outdated comedic figure, Lucy says. He has a sincerity about him that resonates with people. Fiona crosses her arms, admitting there might be something to that. She muses that she's never been about stifling authenticity. She simply wants accountability for views she sees as out of sync with modern values. Lucy points out that maybe accountability can sometimes come via open conversation rather than rhetorical takedowns. One evening, while at home, Fiona decides to watch the entire interview again, from start to finish, analyzing every moment to figure out how it diverged from the typical comedic roasting. She realizes that, after a few minutes, Steve's responses took on an introspective tone, and she inadvertently responded in kind, stepping away from her comedic arsenal and leaning toward real dialogue. She notices small details, The hush in the audience, the looks of real interest on people's faces, the lack of cheap laughs. A conflicting swirl of pride and confusion stirs in her. Did she lose, or did she win at a different game? She decides to share some thoughts on social media the next day, tweeting that the conversation was unexpectedly meaningful and that sometimes authenticity resonates more than comedic point scoring. The tweet gains traction. People comment that they'd love to see more episodes like it, where the host and guest actually exchange ideas instead of jockeying for comedic dominance. Meanwhile, on Steve's side, the feedback is equally varied. Some longtime fans declare that he handled Fiona's show with class, while certain more conservative audiences worry he softened his stance too much. Others, who never particularly followed him, say they gained a new respect for how he championed the notion that comedic roots need not be thrown out entirely, but can adapt in a changing world. He remains mostly silent about the media chatter, continuing his schedule of filming, philanthropic events, and stand-up gigs. In an interview for a separate publication, asked about the Fiona incident, he simply says he enjoyed having a sincere talk, and if it changed a few minds or bridged a gap, then it was well worth it. Eventually, word spreads that Fiona might invite him back or interview guests of a similar generation. People wonder if she's pivoting her brand to incorporate more thoughtful dialogues, less reliant on comedic pummeling. She gives a half smile in an interview when asked, saying that late night can be comedic but can also host genuine discourse. She also hints that Steve's visit reminded her that conversation can be as influential as jokes. In the weeks that follow, the late-night spotlight sees a shift in how Fiona structures her interviews. She still brandishes her cutting humor, but she occasionally uses it as a lead-in to deeper questions rather than as a final blow. Some loyal viewers notice this, some welcome it, others pine for the old style. Yet the ratings remain steady, perhaps because the show is no less entertaining, just evolving. Tabloids run headlines about Fiona goes soft or gains depth. Meanwhile, some comedy purists argue that talk show confrontation is half the fun, that Fiona shouldn't become too nice. But she remains unbothered, forging a new groove for herself. For Steve, life resumes at its usual pace. Sometimes at appearances or on social media, fans mention the Fiona interview, praising how he stood his ground with poise. He thanks them, typically adding that conversation is a two-way street, and he appreciated how the show ended up. He never claims victory, nor does he degrade Fiona. In his stand-up material, he might reference the experience humorously. I visited a late-night show, thought I was walking into the lion's den. Turned out we had a decent chat. Audiences laugh, loving that he can maintain a comedic angle while respecting what actually transpired. A certain intangible ripple effect lingers. People who typically watch the late-night spotlight for comedic takedowns find themselves pausing to consider the lines between comedic critique and genuine conversation. Those who follow Steve might realize that comedic evolution is possible, that an entertainer from a different era can remain relevant if he's willing to reflect. Critics note that the best interviews are those that defy expectations. Fans of both camps start looking for more cross-generational dialogue on late-night TV. Perhaps, they say, the airwaves have enough room for comedic jabs and sincerity, for edgy jokes and measured responses. The network, noticing the heightened discussion around Fiona's show, invests more in marketing upcoming episodes, teasing who's next on the late-night spotlight. Will Fiona spark another surprising revelation? The conversation about comedic generational divides picks up steam in other talk shows, with a few commentators remarking that maybe we don't need constant combative approaches. Some even credit Steve's calm presence with demonstrating an alternative dynamic. You don't have to engage in rhetorical warfare to get your points across. Over the next month, Fiona does a handful of interviews herself with various media outlets, discussing the season's success. When pressed about the show with Steve Harvey, she calls it eye-opening and says she gleaned that not every comedic persona from an older era is stuck in the past. She clarifies that she still disagrees with some of Steve's stances, but that the interview was better served by letting him fully articulate them, giving her an opportunity to question them more meaningfully. She tells reporters that her brand is still comedic critique, but that she's recognized that an audience might also crave depth and reflection. In turn, Steve is asked on one of his talk shows about how he managed to remain so unflappable under Fiona's pointed lines. He chuckles, replying that after years in stand-up, facing countless hecklers and critics, you learn composure. Also, that with age often comes a sense of ease. You no longer feel the same need to defend every comedic statement to the death. You can listen, adjust, or hold your ground as needed without losing your cool. The story reverberates across entertainment columns for a time, eventually settling into a cultural footnote, but the mutual shift remains. Fiona and her staff find themselves referencing the experience whenever they plan interviews, asking, "Is this a comedic confrontation or an in-depth talk? Or both?" Steve occasionally crosses paths with guests who mention that they admired his composure, telling him that episode taught them something about constructive dialogue. Years down the road, when recapping their careers, both Fiona and Steve might remember that night on the Late Night Spotlight as a moment of transformation. For Fiona, it was a pivot, showing her that comedic evisceration, while entertaining, isn't the only path to a successful interview. For Steve, it was a reaffirmation that sincerity transcends generational differences, and that a calm, assured presence can disarm even the most biting sarcasm. Fans, too, often recall that episode. You remember when Fiona tried to roast Steve, but they ended up having an actual conversation? For a time, viewers had come expecting fireworks. Instead, they received insight. The comedic setting opened a door to meaningful discourse, bridging an ideological gap between a progressive late-night host and an older comedic figure who, while not always aligned with modern progressive stances, wasn't as rigid as stereotypes suggested. People realized that communication can flourish if both sides, one armed with sarcasm, the other with unwavering calm, remain open. And that is how the night that was supposed to be a comedic onslaught instead became a hallmark for conversation that transcended comedic jabs, leaving watchers silent in awe rather than cackling for a takedown. In the grand scheme of late-night television, episodes fade and trending moments are often ephemeral. Yet some episodes carry weight beyond the broadcast. This was one such instance. The typical comedic roast gave way to something far more enduring, a demonstration that old-school comedic instincts can coexist with new-age perspectives if approached with honesty and respect. And so, that particular broadcast of the late-night spotlight stands in memory as the evening when a liberal journalist aimed to mock Steve Harvey in front of the nation, only to spark an unexpectedly introspective interview that left an entire studio hushed and many hearts changed in ways they never saw coming.